Find the verses for this morning. It's going to be really slim on verses, so hang with me. But we're going to jump into a couple things. We're starting a series today out of the book of Mark, and I want to talk to you over the next few weeks leading into the holidays about what I think is a really important topic. Who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? I realized recently that I tend to talk a lot about my grandfathers. I don't know, this has been something new for me. I lost both of my grandfathers just in the last 5 years, so they were definitely well on their way. One was just a few weeks shy of 100 years old, and as I think about them, I think one of the reasons I like to talk about them is I'm always thinking about what's it like to have lived that long and to have seen so many changes in the world. What they must have seen. I mean, if I stop and just look at when they were born alone, both of them, their mothers, right before they were born or right at the point of them being born, both of their mothers gained the right to vote in this country. So think about that. I love that. That's a great thing. It's embarrassing that it took that long, but I mean, if you're like me, you kind of go, I'm not that far removed from some kind of strange times as far as our country and our history. I think about communication, the things that have happened over their lifetime, what they saw. They both, one was born, one had not yet been born when radio came on the scene in 1920. By 1925, they're both small children, and TV came into being. So think about that. These are people that just my grandparents who didn't even have TV at a certain portion of their life, and then as things moved along in 1927, the thing evolved called the jukebox. Now, most of you don't understand what that is. But this machine, this big box, could be put in public places like soda shops, and you could drop a coin in and listen to a record. The amazing thing was they had a selection. You got to choose which record. You got a choice in the original jukebox of one of 8 albums. That's it. 8 songs, because they were just small records. 8 songs. I laugh because today, if you've got an iPhone, you probably have Spotify. And if you have Spotify, you have access to almost every piece of music that's ever been written, right? I still carry my iPod Touch. I like it. I have 5,200 songs that I can drop in my pocket. They got a selection of 8. Things have changed in a short period of time. Even the way we communicate, the way things are communicated, our news has changed so drastically. It's transformed everything. Headline news over the last 100 years has drastically changed. In fact, I was a freshman in high school in 1980 when all of a sudden MTV came online, which was something to celebrate at that time. It's not anymore because they don't play music anymore. But MTV came online, but also 24-hour, 7-day-a-week news media came online. And it was the first time I'd seen that. Prior to that, if you're like in high school now, you learn this, maybe your teacher will want to know this one day. If you, prior to that, we had this thing that happened every night at midnight. Your TV station went black. Just fuzz. That's it. In fact, they played the national anthem and then it went off and no more TV. It was time to go to bed. Things have changed drastically. And our headline news, even our printed press, the place where we've always gotten news headlines that would kind of represent big things happening in our culture, even that has changed, right? Back in the day, there was a place in most offices called the water cooler. I doubt you have that anymore, but maybe some. We have a water cooler out here because we don't have a water fountain in this building. We have a water cooler. What happened? At the water cooler, you went for a break during the workday. You got a drink of water. Probably somebody else met you there, and before long, you engaged in some kind of conversation. What were you talking about? The headline news of the day. What was going on in your life? That changed. Because the headline news, the places we have those conversations now, they're on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and they're online, even in text messaging. So you now have the ability in some ways to kind of create your own headline news and throw it out, and it's a whole different world, right? Headlines are designed to grab your attention. They're designed to draw you in. They're designed to make you pay attention to something that might have been or could be earth-shattering, could be something new, something bold, something we've never seen in the world before, or it might just represent something that happened locally. Think about some of the headlines that possibly you've at least seen in a history book. Can you imagine the headline the day that Hitler died? Can you imagine the headline back here in this area the day Kennedy was shot. You imagine the headline when the first men walked on the moon. Some of you still remember the headline on 9/11. They were headlines that would, in some ways, those big ones would change kind of our outlook, change our thinking, change even the direction of some of our lives as we were confronted with things that were just huge in our world. Who would have ever guessed? Sometimes a headline comes along and it's small on the day it comes out. But then after that, you look back and see how you might have missed it. Could you have ever predicted when the Wall Street Journal back in 2007 announced the release of the iPhone, what was going to happen just in 2007, 12 years ago? And now look at where we're at today. It's getting harder, I think, today to discern which headlines are important, because the news cycles are getting shorter, right? Like within 24 hours, you'll have several different news cycles and several different big headlines, and we've run out of superlatives, right? We don't always know what to use to say to make something important anymore. If I had to guess, this old ad I'm about to show you would no longer really appeal in today's market. That Barnum and Bailey Circus would be considered the greatest show on earth is probably not going to play anymore, right? And there's that nice superlative. But we face these short news cycles, we face these headlines, and now we're all trying to figure out, who do we even trust? What news source can we trust? What headlines can we trust? What do they even mean in my life, right? I want to jump into Mark. Mark is one of four Gospels. In the four Gospels, the reason there are four, I'm going to give you a quick outline because I want you to understand why there are four. There are four Gospels, each written about the life of Jesus by four different men. Four different men means four different personalities, four different accounts, but they all had one headline. The headline was simply this: to make Jesus known. That was the headline. That's what all four men were going after. But as they told their story, the uniqueness of their story was that it would come through their personality, and you would get an account of the life of Jesus that maybe resonated with you in a way that would help you understand who he was. You have to remember, when these guys wrote these four accounts, they were not trying to write a Bible. They were not trying to create a whole new church or a whole new system. They were not trying to become famous. They were not thinking they were going to write this and one day we're going to bind all this together and we're going to make this book and it's going to be important for all of history. That's not what they were doing. These four men simply were standing back, and as they had walked with Jesus for 3 years, as they walked with him, listened to him, watched him perform miracles, listen to him say to people, your sins are forgiven, but then to emphasize that what he said was good, he would heal a person in some miraculous way, just as a show of power. As he walked, and then he would start talking about his own death, and then he would talk about his resurrection, and then one day the day came when he pulled all of that off. And they killed him, and 3 days later, he walked out of the grave on his own. These disciples, these four especially, they had been with him through all of that. So they wrote because they wanted to write about something that to them was headline news. This was worthy. This was worthy of being told to everybody. This was worthy of putting out in front of the whole world. Make Jesus the headline. Now, if you've ever struggled with the four accounts, let me kind of give you just a quick little background. So this is part history and hopefully something that will encourage you along the way. When you look at Matthew wrote his account more for a Jewish audience. We know that because of the phrases he used. We know that because of the emphasis of his writings. Most of Matthew has this going for it. It's taken a lot of the Old Testament promises and talks about how Jesus was the fulfillment of those Old Testament promises. He even starts at the very beginning of Matthew. He talks about the family lineage, the tree of Jesus. Why? Because in Jewish culture, they were looking for a Messiah. But they knew the Messiah had to come through a specific line, the line of David. So as Matthew starts his account, he starts writing the whole lineage of David up to Jesus. And that was to represent something to the Jews of that day, especially, who did not know who Jesus was. So here's the headline news. Write this down for Matthew. Matthew's going to write this, that Jesus is the King of the Jews. That's the big news from the Gospel of Matthew. That's what he wanted you to walk away with. When you get to Luke, the interesting thing about Luke, if you don't know much about him, is he was a doctor back in the day. When Luke starts to write, he's going to write in more of an intellectual way. The way he writes and puts his words in the events together, he's not going to be, listen, he doesn't write as if he's the only eyewitness. Luke actually goes out and listens to the eyewitnesses, hears their stories, validates them, and then writes things down. Luke writes to great detail about this perfect man. And the interesting thing is, Luke's gospel got spread around the Greek culture a lot. And if you know anything about the Greek culture, they were always looking for the perfect man in their art and their literature. So Luke is convinced that Jesus is the man, and that's his headline news. He was convinced Jesus is the Savior of all. That was Luke's headline. And he wrote that, and it got picked up, and the Greek culture really understood Luke. You didn't have to have all the Jewish history lesson to understand who Jesus was, and so that's how Luke wrote it. John, the third gospel. John had a simple headline. Jesus is God. Jesus is God. John really just wanted to inspire belief. He even says it. He says, look, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that I could have written down, a whole lot of things Jesus did, crazy stuff, miraculous stuff. I didn't write that stuff down. I wrote down just enough. What I wrote down is enough for you to be able to believe who Jesus said he was. That's what he wanted to do. He wanted to inspire belief in the people around him. He wanted people to exercise faith. Mark, the one we're going to camp out in for a little bit, Mark writes, this is his headline, that Jesus is the suffering servant. He talks a lot about the authority of Jesus. Now, his audience, we learn through the way he wrote it and then who circulated the letter, his audience tended to be more of a Roman audience. They were part of the empire. He didn't start with a family tree. He didn't start with a lineage. He didn't start with all the Old Testament promises because they didn't know any of that. So Mark's going to start with just bold statements straight up front. Mark's going to start talking, and he's just out of the chute. It's like he's going to print the biggest headline of his day that he could print. Let's look at it. Mark 1, starting in verse 1. It says, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. The beginning. In the beginning. This is like great story time for Mark. This is like, you've heard some of the lines. This is the best of times. This is the worst of times, right? You know what that's from? Tale of Two Cities, a great novel. This is like the beginning of one of the greatest movie series ever. Long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, right? I'm glad some of you still caught that. That gives me hope for us, right? This is Mark saying, in the beginning, he's not using it like Genesis 1, where it says in the beginning God created. Mark's saying in the beginning of the gospel. So in this moment, there's a story that's coming about, a great story, one that's so great that I have to tell it to you. And we're going to start at the very start of that story. He says, in the beginning, at the start of the gospel. That word really just very simply means good news. Now, there are some other implications in that word, though. Good news. He says at the very start, at the very beginning of the good news, so you got to pay attention because some good news is coming, and it's the very beginning of how it all started. He says, this is good news. Back in the day, the way news traveled back then was typically by a messenger. You probably knew that. You learned it in school. If a town needed to communicate with another town, they might write up a little letter, but a messenger had to carry it. Somebody had to deliver that message. A lot of times the messages would just be delivered vocally, orally. Somebody would show up and give you the news. The problem with news back then is if you were the bearer of bad news, here's what could happen. If the king was upset with your news, he might decide that he was upset with you. And so he would take out the fact that you brought him bad news on you. Messengers died a lot back then. I'm trying to figure out who wanted to be a messenger. Why would you want to do that job? But I guess somebody had to. Now the flip side is if you brought really good news, you know what would happen? You might be included in celebration, right? That there's reason to rejoice. There's reason to celebrate. Mark says, in the beginning. At the start of this whole thing, there's this good news. News, not just of everyday occurrence. The word actually means good news, news about a change, news about something new God is doing. Some people will interpret it, kingdom authority has come. In other words, it's not just news that Jesus showed up to do something, it's what he did. That he brought kingdom authority with him, that God was going to issue and start a new period of rule, that God was doing something brand new. We argue a lot, and around Journey, we don't really talk politics, right? Because I'm not interested in opinions and in creating dissension and fighting. I want to talk kingdom. I want to talk gospel. In a lot of America, we're getting wrapped up in discussing, well, America is a Christian nation, right? That's our history. I don't know. Here's what I know. America was founded on some Christian principles. We can't argue that, okay? So let's just leave it there. But the idea about this kingdom rule is that it's not about any nation. There was never in this announcement of this beginning of good news, it was never about a single earthly nation. It was about a rule of God that was coming to the earth. And it was going to be coming through the people, the church, the individuals who were followers of Jesus. It was not about making a nation that would go out and carry the gospel. It was about the people, the church, who would carry the gospel. It was not about a show of power and dominance on a global scale. It was about, at a local scale, where the church would manifest the kingdom, the rule, the authority of God. Does that make sense? This is totally different than so many times we think about Christianity now in the Western mindset, and we think in terms of dominance. We think in terms of elections. We think in terms of who has the biggest numbers. Mark says something is coming, something is here, and it's new, and it's a reign of God that's never been seen like this before. And we're moving away from a nation that's going to model who God is, and we're moving towards people, the church, bonded together. And so your nationality doesn't matter anymore. Your ethnicity doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that you have trusted Jesus Christ. And this is the ushering in of this new message. This is the gospel. I got a little humored this week. So if you're not up to pop culture, let me bring you up just a little bit. Kanye released a new album. Kanye has a new professing faith in Jesus Christ. And he's released an album that expresses that. And the first thing that I started hearing in all the chatter was this. Well, Kanye's not a Christian. Look at his life. Look how messed up he is. Look how crazy he's been. There's no way Kanye's a Christian. The first thing we do a lot of times is we start wanting to control the story. And here's a guy who says, the kingdom, the power of God has come to rule in my life. And the first thing sometimes we do is we tear him down. Folks, the kingdom is the expression of the rule of God in somebody's life. And that doesn't mean they're going to be perfect, but it does mean that they're going to be different. And we should celebrate that, right? And it's not about creating a country. It's about us following that new rule. Look, he says, the beginning of the gospel of who? Jesus. Not of me, not of you, not of some other big famous preacher. The beginning of the news, the reign of the power of God, of Jesus. Who? Jesus Christ, the Messiah. Jesus was a very popular name. It was completely a regular name, like John. It was used everywhere back then. In fact, it's still pretty popular today. He said Jesus, but not just any Jesus, Jesus the Christ. That's not his last name. Jesus the Messiah, Jesus the deliverer, Jesus the anointed one. There is this one man who brought this, and by the way, look how he finishes that first verse, the Son of God. That's a phrase they actually would have been more familiar with than us. Remember I talked to you about Mark was writing to a lot of Romans, especially the empire? Emperors for Rome would demand that people viewed them as God. They would declare themselves to be God. They would say they were sons of God. So when Mark says he's the Son of God, he's saying, no, not this over here. There's one man come to earth, brought the power, the reign of God to us, exposed us to it, opened it to us, and he is Jesus, the Messiah. There's one, the Son of God. So verse 1 is this giant headline, and here's the headline. Write it down. Jesus is the Son of God. It's this declarative statement that Mark's going to make at the very beginning. He says, here's the headline of my day. Here's the story you need to know. Here's the thing that's so important. It's marked my life, and it'll mark yours too. He makes this statement, and he doesn't put all these qualifiers on it. He doesn't, like us, he doesn't say, oh, no, it's the Presbyterians, it's the Catholics, oh, it's the Methodists. No, it's the message, the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, the deliverer. That's how the rule of God comes about. That's how the power of God comes about. Not because you got a t-shirt from the last, go into my closet. I think I tucked some of them away. I bet I've got 200 t-shirts from churches over the years. It's not because I got a t-shirt that I am affiliated with Jesus Christ. It's because when I follow Jesus Christ, the reign of God comes into my life. The kingdom becomes expressed. That's what he's talking about. Have you ever gone to a thrift store and seen how you can a lot of times find somebody's old work shirt or company shirt? You'll see an MCI shirt in there. You'll see some AT&T stuff. You'll see just random shirts. You might see a realtor shirt or something. You can buy that shirt and put it on. It doesn't make you an employee. It doesn't make you an employee of that company, right? You can put on a shirt. You can attend the service. It doesn't make you a follower of Jesus Christ. Following him makes you a follower. Putting your trust in him. That's where the power of the kingdom will come out. I was reminded this week of you've heard this, I know you have. Martin Luther King made a statement years ago. He said the most segregated hour of Christian America is 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. That's really tough because when he says that and when I hear it, when I read it again and I think about it, there's just no power in that, right? That means that a lot of times we're clinging more to our sign out front, or we're clinging to our special translation, or we're clinging to our denomination, or we're clinging to our history more than we are to the headline. In the beginning of the gospel, the news, the reign of God that came through Jesus Christ, the Son of God. That title should mark your life. But the question is, does it? Does it? How does it? Mark's going to keep going down the story here, and we don't have the chance to cover all these verses, but he's going to start talking about this guy named John the Baptist, and John comes and he's baptizing people. And again, they understood baptism, I think, in their culture a little more than we do. Now I think people think, oh, that's just one of those crazy religious things you do. But in their day, the term baptize was a term used for dyeing cloth. So you could take some white material, and if you immersed it in purple dye, you baptized it. You reassigned it to a new color. Baptisms were actually initiation rituals. Lots of organizations back then would have had baptisms. This was much more common in their understanding. So this guy John comes about, and again, Mark doesn't explain a lot, but the Old Testament Malachi talks about this guy who's going to come, and he's going to talk about Jesus. Mark just says, well, here's a guy, and he's baptizing, and the baptism is a new baptism that shows that God is doing something new. And in Mark 1, verse 9, here's where we'll pick it up. He says, in those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee. Let me help you understand what he just said. When I finish up here in a little bit, I have to leave very quickly and go work with a church plant out in West Texas from our association. I get the privilege of kind of helping coach some guys who are doing what we've been doing here. And I'm going to drive out to Tahoka, Texas. Raise your hands if you've been through Tahoka, Texas. I'm shocked, okay? So a couple of you. When he says, in those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee, it's like saying in the Bible, in this writing, he came from Tahoka. Everybody would have said, huh? It was a small place. It was a small place. And we read that and we tend to rush by it today because we don't know that. But if you know that Nazareth is this really small place, here's what you start to understand. That God's not really concerned with size. What he's concerned about is, what did he say in verse 1? The gospel, the reign of God, the power of God in your life. And to prove it, he brought the power of God through this small town where nobody was watching for a Messiah. Keep going. Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And when he came up out of the water, immediately he saw the heavens being torn apart, torn open, and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. This is an interesting word, that word torn. If you want to, this week, have some fun, go read towards the end of Mark's whole gospel account. He's going to use that word torn one more time. It's this understanding, is this sense, is just something being ripped apart. And at the end of the gospel, in the temple, as Jesus is dying on the cross, there's a giant curtain that would hang. The curtain, they say, was about the width of a man's forearm to the tip of his fingers. And that curtain separated, from Old Testament days, separated where the presence of God was to all the people who were not holy enough to be in there with God. So it was this divider. When Jesus hung on the cross, Mark says that veil, that curtain, was actually torn from the top down. From the top down to symbolize that no man could have crawled up there and tore it. In fact, nobody could tear it. It was, when I tell you it's that wide, that was part of the genius of this thing. It was impenetrable just about. So this tearing, this ripping signifies something again is going on. When it says he could see the Spirit descending on him like a dove, what we understand is that Jesus got to see the reality that we don't get to see all the time, right? In fact, most of we'll live our whole lives. We won't see that reality in this world. Jesus got to see it. And it says, verse 11, and a voice came from heaven. And here's what he said. You're my beloved Son. With you, I'm well pleased. There's so much in there we could talk about, but I want to talk about just that last piece for just a second. Why did he say that? Why say, with you I am well pleased? What was he going for? The kingdom of the kingdom of heaven expressed on earth. People missing God because Nazareth is too small. They were looking for authority and dominance. They wanted global leadership. What was going on when Mark says, with him I'm well pleased? A few letters later, Paul's going to write this in Romans. He's going to say, if you follow Jesus, you put your faith and trust in Jesus, you become sons and daughters of God. When Jesus came and he became human and he walked on this earth and he allowed John to baptize him physically and basically become a part of our world and a part of who we are, and he walked this life, but he walked it perfectly. When all of that was happening, God looked at me and said, this is my Son, I'm well pleased. And through that, God now can look at us and say, you're my kids. I'm really well pleased. When my kids were born, I would take each one, two, and I would go and I would drive the nurses crazy. Ask my wife. I would drive them crazy because the second they got them clean, they were mine. I wasn't giving them back. And my daughter, my firstborn, when we had her, because you're really young and very naive if you don't know that, but you think you got this figured out, and somebody gave me a baby, right? And I'm walking the halls with her, and nurses are looking for me, but I'm just walking and I'm just telling her. I said, and I don't know what made me do this. It's not like I was trying to be super spiritual. I just told her how pleased I was with her. I just told her she belonged to me. She belonged to us. That we were going to put our effort by the grace of God into letting her know that as she grew. I did it with my son. I'm not super spiritual. I don't know where that came from. It's just, I remembered that was one of the things for me that was special when my kids were born. When you put your faith and trust, headline news, when you put your faith and trust in the Son of God, There's a gospel, there's a reign, there's something that happens to you. And we don't talk about this enough. You're different. And some of us, we struggle with this because some of us, we didn't grow up with parents who would look at us and say, I'm really pleased with you. Some of us didn't even grow up with parents that say, I like you, right? I mean, let's just be honest. Some of our parents weren't that great. Some of our fathers never said things like this. And if they didn't, then this is kind of sometimes hard news to hear. But the God of the universe, the Son of God, shows up, brings the reign of God into this world, and says what? God can say, I'm pleased with you now. And He's pleased with you. And that's the headline news. That, as Mark starts his gospel, that's what he wants us to know. Something miraculous has happened, something big, something changed, something greater than the world has ever seen. And folks, it's not just attending a service, and it's not just putting on a t-shirt. It's not going to a potluck we're planning in a few weeks. It's not just attending an event. It's not just even forcing yourself to sit down and read the Bible for 5, 10, 15 minutes every day. Something happened. You've been realigned if you follow, if you trust Jesus Christ. And yes, it's kind of like when Jesus looked up and it says the heavens were torn open and He could see things that we've never seen. Yeah, that's a little bit like what it is, because you can't physically always see this, right? Nor do you always feel it in your life. But Mark says, here's the headline news. Here's what happened to you. Now by faith, we have to walk it out. So here's the question. You guys know I like questions. Has this headline changed your story? Has this headline changed your story? Don't be afraid of it. Don't be afraid to sit with God this week. Ask Him. Ask Him. Can you see? Do you know? We're coming to understand that Jesus is the Son of God, and following Him has changed your story. And for some of you, you're sitting here thinking, I've never even heard this. I've gone to church and never heard this. And maybe this is the first time for you to step in and say, I want to be a part of this story. This makes more sense. This doesn't feel like an angry God wanting to slap me around. This feels like a holy God that loves me so much that He decided to do something about it, right? And when we start to live like that, church, here's my hope for us, especially in this community. When we start to live like that, then we can live differently in our neighborhoods, in our communities, in our families. And we've got a message, a headline that can make the difference in somebody else's life. Has this headline changed your story? Jesus is the Son of God. Have you ever said, yes, I want to follow Him. Yes, I trust Him. I get it now. Or have you not made that decision yet? But if you have made the decision, can you see it? Are you aware of how He's changing your story, how He's growing you, how the kingdom of God can come to reign in your life every day, and you can be different? Let me pray for us.